By the end of the Second World War, few names in France provoked as much hatred, disappointment, and sorrow as that of Marshal Philippe Pétain, once the hero of Verdun, later the man who surrendered France to Hitler and led the collaborationist Vichy regime. But what is often forgotten is just how pitifully this once revered national hero ended his life. Stripped of power, dignity, and even proper health care, wasting away in what was a prison on a freezing, windswept island. This is a story of the brutal end of Philippe Pétain. To understand the bitterness of Pétain's final days, we have to remember who he was and what he became. Born in 1856, Philippe Pétain rose throughout the French army ranks and became a national hero in World War I. In 1916, during the hellish battle at Verdun, he became the man who would not yield. His leadership and calm saved France from collapse. After the war, he was worshipped as a savior. Streets, schools, and statues were dedicated to him. But when France fell to Nazi Germany in 1940, Pétain, then in his 80s, accepted leadership of what became the Vichy regime. He signed an armistice with Hitler and ruled over the unoccupied zone of France, presenting himself as a paternal protector. In reality, Vichy France actively collaborated with the Nazis, rounding up Jews, persecuting resistance members, and enforcing repressive laws. By the war's end, the French people's view of Pétain had transformed from veneration to disgust. The hero of Verdun was now seen as the traitor of Vichy. After Germany's defeat, Pétain fled to Switzerland, but in April 1945 he returned voluntarily to France, perhaps believing his service in World War I would save him from execution. Instead, he was immediately arrested. His trial began in July 1945, and it was a national spectacle. The courtroom was packed with journalists, soldiers, and former resistance members. The frail 89-year-old Pétain sat silently through most of it, seemingly detached, sometimes dozing off as the prosecution read out charges of treason and collaboration. When he did speak, he defended his actions as an effort to protect France from total ruin, claiming he tried to shield the nation from German brutality, but few believed him. The verdict came swiftly, guilty of treason, and he was sentenced to death by firing squad. General Charles de Gaulle, now leader of liberated France, intervened. He reduced Pétain's sentence from death to life imprisonment. De Gaulle later explained that he refused to make a martyr out of an old man who was already condemned by history. So instead of facing a firing squad, the 89-year-old Pétain was sent to spend the rest of his life in prison, exiled to a desolate fortress island off the western coast of France called Île-d'Yeu. This rocky island in the Bay of Biscay, surrounded by cold Atlantic winds and accessible only by boat, was isolated and bleak. It was once used for military defense, and now it became the final cage for a man who had once commanded millions. Pétain was held in Fort de Port-Levis, a grim 19th-century fortress built on the island's highest point. Its thick stone walls, iron gates, and narrow slits for windows made it both secure and soul-crushing. At first, he was accompanied by his loyal nurse, Jean-Marine, and allowed a few comforts: a small stove, a bed, a desk, and books. But his health was already failing rapidly. He was deaf in one ear, blind in one eye, and often confused. His memory faltered, and he would sometimes call his guards by the names of his soldiers from the First World War. Winter on the island was especially brutal. The Atlantic storms battered the walls. The damp seeped into the prison, and temperatures dropped below freezing. Petain, frail and old, shivered constantly. He complained that he could not feel his fingers. At times, guards had to wrap him in multiple blankets just to keep him alive. As the years passed, Petain's physical decline was matched by his mental collapse. By 1948, he was 92 years old and suffering from severe dementia. He would sometimes talk to imaginary assistants, giving the once proud marshal, who had stood in shining uniform before cheering crowds in Paris, was now a ghostly figure, toothless, thin, and barely conscious. His cell smelled of damp and decay. He was spoon-fed by attendants, sometimes refusing food or water. By July 1951, Petain was bedridden and delirious. He slipped in and out of consciousness, occasionally muttering words from his past. Verdun, France, soldiers. On July 23, 1951, at 4:25 in the morning, Philippe Pétain died in his cell. He was 95 years old. The French government refused to grant him a state funeral. His body was buried quietly on the island in a simple grave near the local cemetery of Port-Chamville. The tomb bears the inscription, Philippe Pétain, Marshal of France. Even that wording sparked outrage, as many believed he had forfeited the right to the title. For decades afterwards, right-wing loyalists periodically petitioned to have his remains transferred to the cemetery at Verdun, to lie amongst the soldiers he had once commanded. Every French president has refused. In 1973, a group of extremists even stole his coffin from the island, demanding his reburial at Verdun as a form of national reconciliation. The police recovered it a few days later, and it was quietly returned to the island, where it remains to this day. Philippe Pétain's final years were a cruel irony. The man once hailed as the Lion of Verdun, savior of France, and father figure of the army, ended his life forgotten, senile, and imprisoned. He had wanted to protect France from destruction, or so he claimed. But instead, his leadership deepened the nation's wounds. His trial and miserable exile became a symbol of how absolute power, even in the hands of a national hero, can lead to utter ruin. Visitors to the island today can still see the fort, a crumbling gray fortress overlooking the Atlantic. There's no museum, no tribute, just silence and sea winds. Petain's grave lies nearby, modest and often ignored. The island itself has become a metaphor for his fate, isolated, windswept, and forgotten by the country he once ruled. The brutal end of Philippe Pétain wasn't one of violence or execution, but of something more haunting, slow decay. His punishment was to live long enough to see his reputation destroyed, his name cursed, and his own mind fade away. In the end, the man who had stood for the defense of France was left defenseless against time, illness, and the unforgiving judgment of history. And so he died, cold, broken, and alone, on a desolate island that became his final, silent battlefield. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. And once again, thank you so much for watching.